Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Debatable Discussions podcast. You join us for another exciting episode as today we delve into a historical question that's perhaps frequently asked, but perhaps also never really seems to have an answer. So we'll try and progress closer towards whatever the answer may be. So, Dan, what is that question?
Well, it's not to be or not to be,
Yeah,
but it is which city has been the most historically important, which has had the greatest historical impact and influence over the world. And I think, John, as you've said, this is one of those questions that if you're ever at dinner and with someone you don't really know and they sort of ask you a question, that's something that you can always rely on. And so what do you think is the most historically important city? But also, it's very hard to answer because there are different metrics of
yeah,
looking at historical significance. One metric we're definitely going to be using today is were it for this city not to have existed, would the world today be any different?
yeah,
So, for example, I would argue that for a city to be historically relevant at all, that condition must apply. So, for example, Athens, without Athens, democracy wouldn't have existed. Therefore, Athens is a relevant historical city for this conversation and debate.
yeah.
I think, on the other hand, there's a couple more metrics that we probably need to clarify first. So, we're going to be looking at the sort of impact it has had in the region, but also throughout, and also we're going to be looking at this period of time that that impact has been sort of relevant for. So, John, start us off. What are some of the contenders for this title?
Yeah, I had a few initial thoughts, and I think really it's such a broad question that you can look at it in so many ways or lenses of history. So initially, I firstly thought of economic history. So if you're looking at economic history, you could think of trade. So cities that are important for trade. One could say Cape Town initially before let's go around the Cape of Good Hope. But then it became, one could say, cities that had profound impact upon trade would be somewhere like Cairo or the Gulf of Aden in Yemen, which were very important. However, one has to sort of think, as you said there, Diane, that definition of if it weren't for that city, what would the impact on world history be? I think they're very historically important. Cities equally like Hong Kong have proved to be essential for world trade, especially the Opium Wars for Hong Kong. So there's some sort of interesting contenders that I had in my head, but also economically, so many cities have had huge economic importance. But I think of Manchester and being as
Wow.
the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution,
Yeah.
and that transitioned the global economy um, into this industrial manner, that being almost an essential city. Similarly, it sort of is a bit cyclical because then one could say San Francisco with Silicon Valley and what is now perhaps an AI revolution, or definitely the technological revolution of this century. So I think from an economic lens, you can sort of think of it in that way. But I'm trying to sort of think of my head aloud. But then you've obviously got a political sense, cities that have had huge political importance.
Yeah.
So you discussed there, Diane, some of the ancient world. But I would say perhaps Paris. Obviously, the French Revolution, which was this seismic political event across the world, it arguably inspired the American Revolution. And perhaps those values that it installed and demonstrated was sort of a key turning point, a key transitioning towards actually the democratic principles that had been laid by Athens. I mean, similarly, there are so many other cities across the world, but I think sort of thinking economically or politically, you've got a sort of a few interesting angles to go down there, Diane.
Yeah.
What other cities come to your head as being perhaps the most important?
Yeah. I want to sort of make an addition to what you said about Paris. I think Paris, you can also look at it from the sort of more modern perspective as this sort of cradle of thought and of art and of culture. With very diverse personalities. So you've had a sort of group of very well-known these existentialist, absurdist thinkers,
Yeah, yeah,
Camus, Sartre, Eugenio Ionesco, a lot of other people, but also you've had the sort of artistic Pablo
yeah, yeah,
Picasso, Modigliani, Ernest Hemingway lived in Paris for a while. So you have this sort of great cultural significance. I'd
Yeah.
also look at cities through their sort of historically sort of philosophical lens, the thought that they provided.
The sort of intellectual history.
Indeed, indeed. So I think, Athens, for me, probably has to be a number one. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the Greeks, the sort of the Stoics, Xenon, the Stoics, the
Yeah.
Cynics, Diogenes, you know, basically fill an entire library full of Greek philosophy. Rome, for the same reason as well, you've got Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, some of the more modern Stoics, but also Cicero and others. Lucian of Samosata as well, another sort of Roman writer. And also the poetry from Rome, some of my favorite, Ovid, Catullus, Martial, Pliny, sort of all these people. But I think you also have to look at this sort of wider spectrum, and maybe if we sort of escape this Eurocentrism for a minute, you've got some cities such as Baghdad and
Yeah.
Damascus that were the sort of cradles of the Islamic tradition. So, Baghdad, especially great library in Baghdad during the sort of 7th centuries that sort of guided and held the sort of writers and scholars of the day at the highest standard. And, to just remind our listeners that the way the West has recovered Aristotle really is through the sort of Islamic invasion of Spain, with them bringing back the text in Arabic and then us being able to recover them that way. So, Damascus, Syria as well. But I think, we can't talk about the most important historical city without making two religious mentions.
Yeah.
Three, actually. Mecca, being Saudi Arabia, the sort of holiest site really for Muslims, where they do the Hajj pilgrimage. And then you have on the other side, you've got Nazareth, the birthplace of Jesus Christ. Again, city of tremendous historical importance for that reason, because of sort of the impact and effects of Christianity. But another city that actually joins them all together is Jerusalem. Jerusalem, has basically been at the center of history and conflict for the last thousands of years. Started, if trust the scriptures, thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, but also throughout a more modern recent history. So I'm going to start actually around sort of 2000 something years ago, when there was sort of Roman invasion, a very bloody persecution of Jews by the Romans in the birthplace of Christ, and all sort of that period, but also the Crusades, perhaps some of the most interesting and important parts of history. I know you can tell us a lot more about them. But moving on from the Crusades, we see Jerusalem being at the center of a conflict now, today.
Yeah.
Israel as a nation, after it was founded after the Second World War, hasn't managed to escape the sort of cycle of conflict. And that's something that, from what I notice, is something that's periodically happened in the region.
Yeah, I really like that. I think for intellectual history, you made a very good point there. A lot of intellectual thought has been based around Rome and Athens. And so if you're looking at which cities have had perhaps the most profound impact on an intellectual basis, I think you could definitely say Rome and Athens. And hence the importance of the study of classics,
Yeah.
a subject which is literally based upon studying these two cities in their ancient times, really as hubs of intellectual thought. So I think definitely them, and perhaps slightly Paris, you could sort of group in with them as real hubs and driving engines of intellectual history, not to sort of diminish the other many, many hundred cities across the world which have made a huge intellectual contribution. But one can see especially those two, but also Paris as a third, cities as being almost real hubs or catalysts or breakaway points in the history intellectually. Similarly, Dan, you mentioned that, and it's interesting, sort of religious history is really sort of based upon these cities in the Middle East,
Yeah.
which have had a profound impact upon religion, sort of globally, these cities.
Yeah.
And that the Middle East being of immense religious importance. And that's not to diminish, I suppose, many of the Asian religions. That also Hinduism, Buddhism, Shintoism, Confucianism, which are founded in equally important cities across Asia, but really, though, nonetheless, the Middle East, definitely in terms of sort of the religious population of the world, has had perhaps the most profound impact as an area,
Yeah.
as the birthplace of so many religions: Christianity, Judaism, um,
Yeah, I think also
Islam. Yeah,
about that, I think, if we look at religious history, it's not just about the influence of the religion itself, but the actions that were made in the name of the religion.
yeah, I
So,
suppose, yeah,
the conquest of America by Columbus and the Spanish in the name of Christianity. Um, many wars were held in the name of Christianity, in the name of Islam, in the name of many religions. But I think we've mentioned San Francisco before, and we mentioned America, and before we were on camera, I was saying that America perhaps wouldn't have that number one city because of its recent history and
yeah,
as a nation, but also because it's sort of discovering was done in such a way that we've lost a lot of information. So the Incas, the Aztecs, obviously very advanced
yeah,
civilizations, but we don't really know as much about them as we do about Athens, for example, or Rome, or Paris, or Berlin, simply because basically the colonizers led by Hernan Cortes, Pizarro, and Columbus, and all these leaders of the armadas sort of burned a lot of information to the ground, and for that reason, actually talking about burning to the ground, I'll make another proposition: Alexandria,
oh yes,
a city of tremendous importance in ancient Egypt, the sort of Library of Alexandria being the most comprehensive library ever built, really, having a tremendous, vast amount of knowledge that now, unfortunately, is lost. Information that could explain how a civilization so long ago was able to build pyramids, the Valley of the Kings, and all these very impressive temples. But I think also we need to look even further back,
oh
look
yeah,
at the Mesopotamians.
oh yeah,
And one city two actually that sort of pop in my mind, and number one is Babylon, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. But more so than Babylon is the city of Uruk in modern day Iraq. And the city of Uruk is sort of famous for a couple of reasons. It's the sort of home of the King Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the sort of most famous books of all time. But also, it's seen as the first place that writing was invented. It's the first place we've discovered writing from on clay tablets. And, obviously, writing, John, has had a huge impact on our
yeah,
lives. And Uruk was really this mega city. It was one of the first mega cities that had 50,000 people. So if we imagine back in ancient times, you'd have your sort of village with 100 people maximum, really. But Uruk was this massive city with 50,000 people in the Mesopotamian region, modern day Iraq. So it was really a birthplace of culture. Culture really flourished, writing flourished. Also, traditions such as pottery
oh.
sort of flourished in Uruk, and the sort of pottery wheel is another invention of the time. But looking more to the modern age, where do you think there's been a profound impact on history in the last 200-300 years?
Well, actually, it's a bit further beyond than the last 200-300 years. I think I'll mention the last 200-300 years in a second. But initially, when you were just saying about the impact of Mesopotamia and Babylon upon writing, I thought of a very influential German city, one that I don't think many would usually think of, but Mainz, the place where obviously Johannes Gutenberg discovered the printing press
Yes.
in the mid 15th century. And actually, they believe it was discovered in China before, most likely. But as a city, Mainz had a huge impact. It changed effectively the medium or basis of human discussion. It allowed all those, perhaps those ideas amongst the intellectual histories of Rome and Greece to be transported. And one could say that they actually sort of led to a fundamental change in human life, the invention of the printing press. It enabled religious history to be spread, intellectual history to be spread, political history equally. And I think the transmission of ideas does actually put Mainz, in my opinion, as being definitely amongst one of the most important cities in the world, simply because of the invention of the printing press there. But I think in the last 200-300 years, there's a few cities in my mind that sort of dominate it. I think one has to recognize the role of the USA in the last 200-300 years,
Yeah.
rising global superpower, perhaps based upon Washington, D.C. and New York. really from, obviously, as many historians discuss, from World War One, but in particular from World War Two, the USA emerged as the world's leading power. The Cold War following it fought between two very historically important cities, Washington DC and Moscow, were the two separate bases of power. But actually, in the middle, you had Berlin, I suppose, a historical city which I think is very important because it actually symbolized the conflict, the battleground of differing ideologies, differing spheres of influence. And as a city, Berlin still architecturally represents that conflict between East and West Germany, conflict which actually had global historical importance amidst the Cold War. I think the states one has to recognize as being just fundamental to the last 200-300 years of human history since the American Revolution, where one saw a huge intellectual political shift away from such ideas like colonization, being a colony, to sort of supposedly wanting to come against tyrannous kings towards, I suppose, steps towards democracy in a way. Very much limited initially, but Philadelphia for the American Revolution was very historically important as a city. I think one area of the world which is often undermined and forgotten in world history is the Far East or even the Indian subcontinent. An interesting fact I always like to remind myself of is until the 18th century, China produced, I think, over half of the world's GDP.
Yeah.
Similarly, there's a circle one can draw between around southern China, India, and Southeast Asia. And that circle of that region of the world represents the majority of the world's GDP, pretty much throughout human history. The importance of cities like Shanghai, similarly Delhi, Mumbai, whilst also Jakarta, Singapore, can be sort of demonstrated by how these were the hub of economic colonization. The Opium Wars by Britain, or their initial attempts to gain a foothold in India, were purely economically motivated. Similarly, Jakarta, the base of the VOC, which was the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch East India Company was revolutionary in what it did, inspired obviously the British East India Company. But initially, the Dutch East India Company was the leading economic, almost powerhouse of the world, which aimed to colonize the Dutch East Indies for aims of exporting nutmeg initially and other spices, these spices which were more valuable than gold. So I think when you look at economic history, you can obviously, as I said earlier on, think of Manchester or Silicon Valley now as places as being fundamental to almost revolutions in the global economy. But when looking at trade, the cities of Southeast Asia and the Far East are extremely important. Jakarta being an extremely desirable global city for trade amongst the age of discovery. And then cities like Shanghai, Mumbai, New Delhi, and other cities across Asia have always been the base of the global economy and world trade. What do you think, Dan? You can look at it sort of economically, but are there perhaps any cities that we've forgotten, perhaps cities in South America or Africa,
Yeah.
of great importance, but can easily be forgotten?
Yeah, I think definitely I'll start with Latin America because
Oh, yeah.
that's the area I'm a bit more well versed in, to be very honest with everyone here. There's a couple of cities that definitely spring to mind. Number one being Cusco, where it's the site of Machu Picchu as well. Cusco in Peru was the sort of home, sort of cultural of the Incas, one of the sort of major empires in Latin America, but also a place of very sort of cultural importance due to obviously the conquest by Spain and sort of, frankly, crimes that were committed there. But also in modern history, if we look at, for example, people familiar with communism, Cusco was actually one of the main sort of catalysts for the conversion of Ernesto Che Guevara into communism after seeing treatment of the local autochthonous population there. The biggest city in Latin America throughout really was Mexico City, founded in the 14th century by the Aztecs, was the capital of the Aztec Empire, and it was conquered in the 16th century and was transformed to modern day Mexico City. But it was very, very wealthy sort of metropolis. And it was one of the most advanced cities in the world. I think we stopped giving enough credit to Latin America because of the fact that a lot of it was destroyed, a lot of the knowledge, a lot of the information was destroyed during the sort of period of conquest by the conquistadors from Spain. But Cusco and Mexico City are definitely very, very important hubs of knowledge and culture. The third one being Lima, it's also known as the City of Kings, modern day capital of Peru. And that is where the Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro, who also conquered Cusco, chose as the administrative center of his sort of South American empire. And this is due to the fact that it had a lot of connections to gold and silver. So, again, talking about that economic history, Lima is truly one of those cities that is up there in the terms of economic importance for Europe because, a lot of gold was brought from Latin America, but also other stuff, potatoes, tomatoes, a lot of food culture, culinary culture was brought from Latin America from these parts. Now in Africa, another city that comes to mind is Carthage, the ancient city of Carthage, famous for its battles with Rome and Hannibal Barca being this very strong general. Apart from that, we look at sort of Morocco, modern day Morocco, Marrakesh, Casablanca, these very important cultural cities as well for their role in sort of the initial conquest of Spain by the Moors, but also its importance lately in history. Morocco, notably, was the place from where the nationalist troops led by Francisco Franco started out in their conquest of Spain in the 1930s during the Spanish Civil War. You've mentioned Cape Town, but I think there's obviously a vast amount of cities that sort of the Horn of Africa, and in those sort of points that allow access to the sea that were hugely important for economic and cultural reasons. I think now, before we end, it'd be nice if we could just run through each continent and sort of say the most important city. And I'm going to split North and South America for ease. So, John, what would you say is the most important city historically in Northern America? So we're including Mexico and everything else.
I'll quickly say, just a sort of quick disclaimer before we say this, there are many more that we haven't mentioned.
Yeah.
And actually, as this discussion's gone on, I think every city is so historically important. So it's not to sort of undermine or diminish the role of any, but there are so many which are historically important. But to pick one for North America for me, I think there's two in my head. I'd be stuck between Washington, D.C. for its political importance, but I'd actually probably for San Francisco, and just for the scientific revolution which it led to, in particular thinking of the internet, something which sort of all those companies, Apple, Google, are based around. And if it were not for those cities, you can see how they fundamentally changed the way humans live. This very platform that we're using now, podcasting, the spread of information, that is only possible due to the internet. So I think the internet's role economically, politically, intellectually, religiously, it covers every part of human history, the internet. So I'd say San Francisco as perhaps sort of, one could say, the focal point of the internet revolution of the 21st or 20th century.
Yeah, I'd choose, just for a bit of variety, I'd choose Mexico City for its sort of role in the Aztec Empire. It was the biggest city of the Aztec Empire and its capital. And it was also the primariest religious site. But I think, so much more is to discover about Mexico City, also from a cultural point. You had some famous artists, Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo, who sort of made Mexico City their sort of base. So I'll choose that. What about Latin America?
Perhaps the group Latin America and the South then. I think you made a really interesting point about Lima, and it's a city I don't know much about, but I'd say then Lima, Peru then, Diane.
I'll choose, again, just for variety, I'll choose Cusco, the ancient capital of the Incas, and actually one of the oldest I think actually is the oldest inhabited city in the Americas throughout history. Very important place just for its sort of exploration of the Incas, Machu Picchu as well, one of the ancient wonders of the world, but also for its sort of architecture, but also its legacy as a
Uh,
city of colonization and what that can do to the world. Moving on now,
oh yeah. I find Cape Town a really interesting city historically. Not only do you have such a rich history in a modern sense of Nelson Mandela, perhaps based around there, but also just economically for trade, a huge key part of the British Empire, not only for as a trade stopover almost, but later expansion into diamonds with De Beers and other parts. So I think Cape Town really strikes out to me as an economic place, but also perhaps a sort of modern political importance. But then similarly, I think Egypt has
yeah,
such a fascinating, rich history. Yeah, I mean, equally, one could make the case for Libya. Is it Tripoli, the capital of Libya,
yes.
with really fascinating modern history? Where would you say, Diane?
I'd probably pick sort of Alexandria or Cairo.
Yeah,
It's very difficult to pick between the two, but definitely an Egyptian city for me. For again, that philosophical importance, that thought, and that knowledge that sort of Cairo actually sprung, and sort of Luxor and everything around Egypt. It's very hard to pick one city, but it'd be one of those. I think let's do the Middle East as a separate place just because of its huge importance. Really, I mean, there's so many places there. Which one would you choose, John?
oh, for the Middle East, I find that really interesting. I mean, it matters what lens you take. So you've got that religious importance for the Middle East that you mentioned there. So perhaps, yeah, perhaps that. Yeah, perhaps that. But then you've got cities like, I don't know, Tel Aviv, which have had immense importance recently. But I'd probably say just to group sort of Jerusalem or somewhere like that.
Yes.
Fundamental impacts and changes have come about in human history from them in a religious sense. Fascinating.
Yeah, I think that's a fair answer and probably what I would have gone for as well. But to give an alternative, I'll choose Baghdad for its importance in the sort of big philosophical sense of the world. The Library of Baghdad in the Islamic Caliphate in the 7th century was one of the most important cradles of knowledge and one of the most well-known scholarly cities.
For Asia, my mind goes to China, at the centre of so much of the world's history, politically, economically, a huge religious, intellectual importance. So I'd probably go for Beijing, the capital of China. Perhaps Shanghai. I mean, Shanghai's always been the sort of economic hub of China, but I think Beijing, as this political, as almost the national, as the capital of China, is such a fascinating city. I'd love to visit one day because I think it's the bed of so much rich political and military history from China. But similarly, I think you can make a very compelling case for Hong Kong as its sort of as it being a remnant of empire and similarly of great historical importance. Where would you go for in Asia, Diane?
Well, I think probably Beijing as well, but
Yeah,
as always, I try and come up with an alternative. And actually, something that really impressed me, I don't know a lot about, but we've spoken about Japan in an episode with
yeah,
historian Chris Harding previously, which I highly recommend. And I'll probably pick Kyoto or Tokyo
yeah,
for a couple of reasons. But number one, I think, is this sort of fascinations that people have had with the Japanese culture, Japanese religion, Shintoism, but also this sort of art of the samurais and this code of honor by Japan. But also, we can't ignore the sort of technological advancements that have come out of Japan and the huge sort of, Tokyo being a city that people say is like 50 years in the future compared to everyone else. So I would pick Tokyo, I think.
yeah. I think there's a really compelling case for Tokyo's importance since the Meiji Revolution, which is in 1868, and when Tokyo restored the emperor, Japan restored the Emperor Meiji, and then that emperor set about a plan of huge advancements across Japanese society, which propelled it into being an imperial power.
Yeah.
And then from that point, obviously led to World War II. But then that sort of technological and economic reconstruction of Japan, companies like Panasonic, is really interesting. To sort of perhaps then a final area, Diane, then we've got Europe, which will go last. But to think of sort of Oceania or perhaps that
Yeah, I
Southeast Asia. Where would you think that?
think it's very, very difficult.
Yeah.
Again, huge range of cities. Probably pick Manila.
Oh, right, yeah.
I'll pick Manila for its role in sort of as a colony as well as
Oh, yeah.
a colony has managed to fight and win its independence back in the sort of domino effect that has had on Spanish society. Um, one of if we look closely at Francisco Franco's life, him seeing sort of ships coming back from the defeated Philippines is one of the most important and sort of most dramatic moments in his life that actually sort of propelled him to become the dictator he was. But another city maybe in that region would be somewhere like Sydney or Melbourne,
Yeah.
one of the major Australian cities of the day, again for their economic importance in the region. But also Australia for me has always been a fascinating place, taking being a colony of prisoners initially, and I think a very compelling case as to why prisoners should be integrated in society and not chained up in a 2 by 2 jail cell, because Australia is now one of the most developed and sort of forward countries out there.
Yeah, I found Manila, that's a really interesting example. I think, obviously, from the US Spanish War, it was at the turn of the 20th century, about 1900. Really interesting, became a US colony effectively. Then a really interesting role in World War II, becoming independent. And then actually, a dictator I've always found really fascinating is Ferdinand Marcos Jr., or
Yeah,
Ferdinand Marcos. Um, Someone who, a fascinating history in the Philippines, of an awful dictator known for his kleptocracy, eventually being almost removed from power by a revolution, but also assisted by Reagan, I think, to live in Hawaii. Similarly, following on from that idea of a place which has had a dictator in the 1960s and 70s, Sukarno, in Indonesia, in particular Jakarta. Jakarta, also in my mind, being this hub of economic activity in Southeast Asia, especially from that 16th to 18th century. So not only then was it of great economic importance, but then that transitioned all the way through to the Second World War, when it was a Dutch colony, then its War of Independence, and then later after that, I think Sukarno, a fascinating historical figure, fascinating dictator, who, interestingly, I remember there was a quote by Rory Stewart, who was working as a diplomat there at the time in Jakarta, who said that the day that Sukarno fell from power, no one was expecting. But someone who's really interesting when looking at sort of an economic political sense. Finally, Diane, the place in which we're both situated, Europe.
yeah.
Which city in Europe would you say is the most important?
For me, it's a very hard decision between two cities. I've managed to cut it down to two, and those are both sort of ancient cities, Athens and Rome. And I'll say exactly why. Rome, I think, has been fascinating for a couple of reasons. Obviously, the Roman Empire, that military history, that political prowess, people like Caesar, Augustus, many other emperors, Cicero, just a senator, but also someone with huge influence of thought, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Nero. But Rome didn't stop there, and it kept going. And you have this Vatican City, the Catholic Church, all the good and the bad that has come from the Catholic Church throughout history. And then looking now, not only do you have still the papacy seat in the Vatican, which is in Rome, but also some Second World War fascism, Mussolini, and starting that movement. I think Rome is probably the eternal city. And for that, it probably has to be Rome for me. But a very, very close second is Athens for its role in the ancient world as the hub. I know we've used that word a lot, but I truly think Athens is a hub of philosophical knowledge. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Diogenes, Xenon, the Stoics, the Cynics, every single, there's a famous quote, I don't know by who, that says that all of modern philosophy is but a footnote to Plato. I find that to be very true, and for that, Athens has to be up there as well. But also, you have that military history. Aristotle taught Alexander the Great, after all, and Alexander was the man that everyone was chasing for. But because of that continuous history across thousands and thousands of years, for me, Rome has to take the edge.
For me, I think to conclude, I would say London. I think London not only doesn't have, I think, primarily as this is, it is a very subjective discussion. I'm very interested in sort of empire, obviously London being the seat of the centre of the British Empire. But also, I think you could make a compelling case economically, having sustained economic importance in Europe today. But intellectually, there's been a fairly significant contribution from the arts based in London. So I'd probably say London. I think part of my judgment for London would be its continued importance today, or sort of continued importance in Europe for the last sort of 200-300 years. But I mean, this is a great discussion, and Dan, at the start, you raised a very good point of how it's a good discussion for a dinner table. This,
Yeah.
because there is no right answer, and you can learn and discover so much, like you have across this episode. So it's a great dinner table discussion because I think we're both sure we've probably missed so many cities that are
Definitely.
important. But it's a great discussion to have, and it sort of gets you thinking, I think, about all these different strands of history and actually how fundamental so many different places have been.
Indeed. Thank you everyone for listening. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please do go back. We have some really amazing episodes on different places. The one that comes to mind is Japan with Chris Harding.
Yeah.
Something that I will be doing over the summer is getting in a bit more in a couple of different regions. And for me, the two regions that I'm definitely going to try and get my teeth in this summer are Latin America and the Middle East. And I'm sure throughout the next couple of months, we'll update you on our progress in discovering the world from this sort of philosophical, literary, and cultural perspective. But thank you, everyone. If you've enjoyed the episode, do leave us a comment, a like, and share it with your friends and family. I'm sure if anyone is in doubt of what to talk about over a dinner table, this is the perfect episode to send to them. And until then, we'll see you next week.
See you there.